All right, everybody, welcome back to the unfortunate almost conclusion of our summer course and look at this incredible, immediate, sort of new classic tip of the spear from Dr. Orasami Burton. As we move here to talk about Chapter 6, The War on Black Revolutionary Minds, Failed Experiments in Scientific Subjugation. But before we get to that, I thought I keep talking about it and making reference to it, and I know we don't have time to get into it for the purposes of this particular class, but I at least wanted to give one sort of concrete example in as to why I continue to say that Dr. Burton's book is, for me as a communication studies scholar, in addition to black studies, but just and all the other fields, anthropology obviously, and others that this book is in sociology, and others that the fields are relevant, that this book is relevant to. But when I keep saying it's my new favorite communication studies book, I wanted to just give a little bit of a concrete example as to why I keep saying that. And so I went back to one of, and maybe is now number two, no disrespect to Chris Simpson, the amazing, please check imixwhatilike.org if you want to learn more about him, an amazing media studies scholar, retired not too long ago at American University. But his book here, Science of Coercion, Communication Research and Psychological Warfare, 1945 to 1960, has been one of my favorite books in terms of communication studies and maybe beyond for a really long time. And still is. So I thought I would go back to it to come up with it to sort of show in one way why I think Dr. Burton's book has been so amazing as a contribution to this research. And as you saw in the title, Communication Research and Psychological Warfare, this has a lot to do with what Dr. Burton has been talking about in his work. But just quickly, in the initial chapter of Professor Simpson's work, defining psychological warfare, he writes something that, again, I think helps in terms of the context for understanding how prisons function and in this society what they're meant to do politically, and then how communication and the manipulation of public opinion and consciousness and psychological warfare all play a role, and how these ideas all overlap. So Simpson writes on page 9, federal agencies such as the Department of Defense, U.S. Information Agency, and Central Intelligence Agency and their forerunners provided the substantial majority of funds for all large-scale communication research projects by U.S. scholars between 1945 and 1960. Despite the heavy secrecy that still surrounds some aspects of U.S. psychological warfare, it is clear that the federal government spent as much as $1 billion annually on the activities during the early 1950s. On these activities during the early 1950s. As is discussed in later chapters, the government allocated between $7 million and $13 million annually for university and think tank studies of communication-related social psychology, communication effects studies, anthropological studies, and foreign communication systems, overseas audience and foreign public opinion surveys, and similar projects that contributed directly and indirectly to the emergence of mass communication research as a distinct discipline. The major foundations, such as the Carnegie Corporation, the Ford Foundation, which were the principal secondary source of large-scale communication research funding of the day, usually operated in close coordination with government propaganda and intelligence programs and allocation of money for mass communication research. He also goes on to talk about the Rockefeller Foundation, obviously connected by family, politics, and money to Governor Rockefeller in the Attica rebellion and uprising and suppression, and the politics involved and all that Burton goes into. So there's just a little bit of an example of an overlap there. The book concludes, that is, Simpson's book concludes with a chapter, The Legacy of Psychological Warfare, by, I think, in many ways, setting the table for research that a few decades later, Dr. Burton would serendipitously, inadvertently, obviously there's no conscious connection here, pick up and end up doing. So Simpson ends by saying, discussion of psychological warfare remains controversial because re-examination of its records leads in short order to a heretical conclusion The role of the United States in world affairs during our lifetimes has often been rapacious, destructive, tolerant of genocide, and willing to sacrifice countless people in the pursuit of a chimera of security that has grown ever more remote. Rethinking psychological warfare's role in communication studies, in turn, requires reconsideration of where contemporary Western ideology comes from, whose interests it serves, and the role that social scientists play in its propagation. Obviously, as we live in a time of aggressive and overt genocide taking place with the support of the United States in Palestine and perhaps expanding, we see that in terms of what Simpson was saying here, as it relates to the U.S.'s relationship to world affairs, is often rapacious, destructive, tolerant of genocide, and willing to sacrifice countless of people. And when Simpson says that this is all done in pursuit of a chimera of security that has grown ever remote, what he's talking about is this pursuit of a fantasy, as I'm looking up the word here again, an unrealizable dream of security. There is no real security in a world where so much hostility, exploitation, settler colonialism, capitalism, warfare is at the foundation. So that's why so much effort has gone into the study of how do you manipulate people's attitudes, or as Harold Laswell, a foundational mass communication scholar, once said something to the effect, the issue is how do we change people's attitudes to an unchanging set of conditions? We're not going to change the relationship. We're not going to stop the hostility. We're not going to stop the violence, but we want to change how you interpret that. And specific to Burton's work, the goal is to make sure that revolutionary black minds are not evolved. The oppression of black people will continue. The exploitation of black people will continue. The goal is to make sure that there is no revolutionary response. And again, as Burton concludes with this chapter, as he's been saying throughout the book, and really even more as we'll talk about briefly with the epilogue, the goal is not fully successful, but is definitely designed to take what is studied in prison and have it be applied outside of prison, with the common goal of not allowing for revolutionary consciousness to emerge. So that's why this chapter is, much like the rest of the book, replete with overlaps between intelligence agencies, state operations, government, and the prisons, all working together to study how to manipulate and suppress radical consciousness, to engage in what they call brain warfare, to control human behavior, to sanitize narratives. Because it was recognized that having already incarcerated insurgent black bodies, only to learn that physical capture did not equal control, counterinsurgency experts tried and failed to exterminate insurgent black knowledge, thought, feelings, behaviors, and even impulses. Again, much like I argue with when it comes to propaganda and understanding the goal of messaging, marketing, branding, advertising, propaganda, public relations, mass communication, semiotic warfare, strategic communication, information warfare, all of these are euphemisms. And my point is always to at least start with the intent, not the effectiveness. As Burton points out, it has not been totally effective, but I think it is equally important that he's pointing out the intent, and that we have to be ever vigilant that the goal is to complete the process of suppressing radical ideas. And as he talks about here, armed struggle, or the Black Liberation Army as an idea. The goal of of these prison programs, much like the goals that Simpson talks about targeting the rest of us, equally militarily, whether it's the CIA's efforts at MK Ultra, which is a whole other discussion. But again, and I wrote a note here to recommend that you all see the Netflix series Wormwood, just as a suggestion of something to look at that will introduce you to some of these histories in documentary form, and I think in a truly brilliant and fascinating way. But the point is, the goal is to find ways to manipulate target populations' consciousness, what they think of the world, to neutralize revolutionaries. And then, as he says, as Burton says on page 186, that by narrating this struggle, I demonstrate that a hidden intelligentsia within the carceral apparatus aimed to decisively conquer the captive population by eradicating the BLA not as a coherent organization, but as an idea. And then it goes back to what George Creel said back in the early 20th century. And when asked, how did you use propaganda to convince young white men to go fight in World War I, George Creel said that we conquered their convictions. So when Burton says that this apparatus was aimed decisively at to conquer the captive population by eradicating the BLA, not as a coherent organization, but as an idea, it's very much the same, I think, very much part of the same process that Creel was describing. You conquer people's convictions, and then you don't have to worry about them picking up a gun against you. You can make them pick up a gun against someone else. This book is called Science of Coercion, and Burton is talking about on page 188 in discussing in his discussion of various mechanisms of how people could be turned into potential automatons. He talks about it as an unacknowledged cognitive science, with the goal, as he says later on 189, of the elimination of ideas. I think it's also important to point out in the both heroic and nightmarish story of Masai that part of the punishment was to prevent communication, as we should also understand in reverse, kind of going back to when I think how Burton asks us to consider from the beginning how Tip of the Spear can be both the beginnings of a revolution and be the beginnings of an anti-counter revolution when in the hands of the state. It's a similar thing here. By preventing communication, it was an effort to control the cognitive space that Masai was captured in, and then in other instances by propagating or projecting or communicating some kind of idea, some sort of reverse idea, maybe going back to previous chapters on gender and white man, the concept of human. Communication is, again, a tactic of manipulation and suppression and warfare. On 194, he talks about Burton talks about the use of psychology in relationship to the state intelligence apparatus, with the goal being to obliterate human consciousness in order to rebuild it anew. And I can't help but think of what they used to tell us in boot camp. We're going to destroy the individual so we can rebuild you as a sailor in the context of the Navy. When we got to boot camp, they literally told us we want to destroy your consciousness, destroy your self-concept as an individual, and so that we can rebuild you as a properly functioning sailor. This is no different than what happens in terms of, as Burton's been talking about, creating an appropriate form of citizenship and humanity among a targeted population. Similarly, on page 196, when Burton is talking about the attempt to destroy the solidarity among all these different oppressed communities within the prisons and the prison struggles, with a goal of, as he says here, to transform people into docile creatures, robot slaves, or neo-slaves, to later in that page undermine the militant audacity of the radical imagination of Masai and other radicals being held as prisoners and looking to rebel. I can't help but think again of the process that scholars like Sut Jali and Chris Simpson and others have pointed out in terms of how media are meant to function. So just the way that concepts can be shaped, much like what is described here, but through the outside apparatus of our media environment, where just one example is Sut Jali talks about the accepted model of marketing and the understanding of marketing history has been what we often hear today, even in terms of music. You get, the consumer gets what they want. You know, marketers, advertisers, corporations are only giving you the music and the films and the kinds of clothing that you want, without ever raising the question of how are those wants developed? Where do those initial desires of the consumer and the market evolve? Where do they come from? And we're meant to think that we have self-evolved our likes and our preferences, from food to politics to race, to sexual identity, to national identity, to movies and music. We always think that we've sort of naturally come to whatever conclusions we've reached, and therefore none of that could have been manipulated. In one sense, Burton has already thoroughly challenged, if not exploded, some of that mythology. But what Sut Jali and other media scholars have pointed out is that this similar process happens outside of prisons, in the sense that our desires, our likes, our wants are themselves shaped so that those in control of the means of production, as Marxists might say, or those in control of society can then provide us with the what they have determined for us are our interests. Going back again to the $1 billion a year in 1950, in the early 1950s, that Simpson talks about, was already being invested in creating this multidisciplinary national exploration into ultimately the manipulation of popular consciousness. So through popular film and television, we can be made to desire that prisons exist to keep those people over there, with this idea that that is keeping us safe, which is obviously not true, given all the not only the proliferation of personal violence, but global warfare, or the structural violence of poverty, inequality, joblessness, insufficient health care, education, so on and so forth. Obviously, it's a fantasy that what's happening in prisons is producing for us this perfect world, but we're meant to in some way rationalize their existence, that is prisons, by that fact, as Burton has talked about already. But it's also in the ability to project onto us what kinds of ideas we might have, not only about prisons and prisoners, but about the people who are incarcerated in our own communities. So what does it mean to be black or African or brown or Latino or white and European, or to be a white, or to be a worker, to be a laborer, to be rich, to be middle class? Like, what do all these things mean, and how do they interact with one another? And ultimately, how do they, for my purposes, at least for now, result in a society with 800 people being worth $6 trillion? But as Sut Jali has pointed out, the revised model of understanding how media work is what we've been talking about here, and what Burton has been talking about here. The idea that our so much of our ideas about ourselves and the world and what it is we think we want are shaped by those forces and entities and groups beyond our perception. And then we just add here with the specific goal of suppressing radical content, because if you can, as Burton writes about on 196, in describing one of the prison programs, it's targeting prisoners. The goal was, its primary objective is to engender marked change of political prisoners' patterns of behavior and attitude, to systematically undermine the fundamental fibers of their third world outlook. This is exactly the kind of language and approach used in marketing to change patterns of behaviors and attitudes towards, for instance, a particular shoe, or a political candidate, or a certain race, or sexual identity, or gender. So if, as Burton points out here, the goal is to create docile creatures, robot slaves, or neo-slaves, the goal for us out here is to reduce us to blind consumers, to limit our thinking in terms of what is the potential for change, for voting, for how we see immigrants, or how we see ourselves, how we see this or that, and all of it with the idea that nobody become a critically thinking, radical, militant revolutionary who might consider the idea of a Black Liberation Army, or the ideas associated with that kind of effort, or with the ideas that are associated with the goals of that kind of effort: socialism, pan-africanism, national liberation, etc. As Burton says on page 203, by tracing these sinuous intellectual and institutional networks, we can see how prisons function as central nodes within global networks of counterinsurgency knowledge production. In other words, as I would interpret that, what Burton has been showing us is that prisons are themselves part of a process that produces a certain consciousness about the world, in the same way when we watch films and TV about police and prisons and the military, we're meant to have a certain knowledge produced for us about those concepts and those institutions, so that ultimately they can operate without sufficient criticism or resistance. From my starting point, the more there is knowledge production, the more that there is counterinsurgent knowledge production, that is the ability to suppress people's critical thinking capability and radical consciousness, the easier it is for them to see television and film presentation and symbolic inclusion as some sort of advance, and not as part of the tactics that Burton has talked about here of concession and rehabilitation being part of the structure that allows, or part of the process, or the structure itself that allows the structure to be maintained. The inequality is maintained by giving us, in this context, media-inspired concessions of inclusion and representation, while all of the other structural violence of exploitation, extraction, etc., continues without sufficient levels of radical critique. So that's why on page 206, in the section on mutations of cognitive war, Burton is connecting all of this to the FBI's counterintelligence program that evolved officially in the 1960s as a mechanism to allow the state to suppress radical formations across the board, specific to black communities and brown communities for sure, but radicals of all backgrounds were targeted by the counterintelligence program. And to the point I was just making, this is why it's important that Burton includes this reference to the FBI special agent in charge of the San Francisco field office, suggesting that it would be advantageous for black youths to aspire to become a sports hero, a well-paid professional athlete or entertainer, rather than revolutionaries. And in other work I've seen how in terms of Latin America, if you ever want to know why there's so many Latino baseball players, baseball was intentionally carried as part of the colonial process, with the idea that better that they have baseball bats than run off in the hills and pick up rifles. In other words, we're going to exploit the land. We're going to steal their raw materials and natural resources. We're not going to allow them to accumulate the wealth from all of that exploitation, because it's all going to end up here in the United States and in Western Europe. So let's have them play ball. Better a baseball bat than a rifle. I also couldn't help but see another overlap in some of my own biased approaches to this, in that, again, Burton continuously makes the point, as he does here on 208 and 209, of the value of and the threat of revolutionary propaganda, where it was at one point thought of as a legitimate concern, which of the prisoners were particularly susceptible to this material, which would become radicalized and which become leaders in radical movements. This was all part of the surveillance of these prison programs to figure out who would be susceptible to revolutionary propaganda. But as Burton continues from 209 to 210, illuminating the ongoing function of prisons as laboratories for developing methods of control aimed beyond prison walls. Brown, who was the leader of this particular bit of research, said the findings would be broadly applicable, since an understanding of those who do respond to these revolutionary concepts might give us a targeted place to find answers to questions involving our general society, end quote. The imperatives of carceral war are never separate from those of empire. So this point about the overlap that I can't help but point out, but on the very next page on 211, when Burton points out that this relationship again of prisons, the CIA, the state, and the suppression of the expansion of empire, U.S. empire, and the suppression of anti-colonial resistance, whether it be in Vietnam or Black America. Burton ends this paragraph on 211 saying, interestingly, the book which Galati describes these methods features a laudatory foreword from William Colby, the former head of the CIA's pacification program in Vietnam, who became director of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1973, again presenting us with what Burton calls the absent presence of the CIA in the development of carceral technology. the absent presence. I like the way he puts that. And then I'm reminded of this book, Alfred and Secker's book, National Security Cinema, in which you read this incestuous relationship between major media and intelligence and empire that prior to the advent of the CIA, or it's being named the Central Intelligence Agency, it was known as the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. In a film during World War II, I believe, there was, or shortly after in the 1950s, just before the CIA took its new name, there was a scene in a film that they talk about that where the actor says something to the effect, "We need a Central Intelligence Agency." And the point the authors of National Security Cinema are pointing out is that, again, this incestuous relationship between popular entertainment and it being propaganda in service of U.S. empire and intelligence agency needs is something often misunderstood. And as they point out, so much of our popular television and film in this country is literally written, funded, produced by people directly or indirectly, coming out of the Pentagon and the State Department. Again, creating for the CIA, in terms of our media environment, an absent presence, just as Burton is describing in terms of the CIA in the development of carceral technology. So as Burton concludes chapter 6 with a reminder of the at least 80,000 people held in some form of solitary confinement on any given day in the United States, an estimated 448,000 people having been isolated just in the last 12 months within what is already an expanded and largest prison population in human history. He's reminding us, as we'll come back to in the epilogue, that the goals here in suppressing a black radical consciousness are not entirely successful, yet they, if I would put it in my language, they are at the moment carrying the day, which is why the prison rebellion and rebelliousness and the movement that that Burton is talking about, it got, as we talked about in chapter 5, the 4 strategies of reform and suppression of radicalism. And what we get out here are mythologies about the efficacy of capitalism, black capitalism in business, the lack of value of organized labor. We're never encouraged to unionize. We get what I've described as the penny trick, or the Vernon philosophy of black media avoidance. In other words, we get false representation of black history and radical history projected to us in popular media, all designed, as I think Burton is describing, of what's happening inside prison walls to suppress a radical consciousness and encourage us to believe that we are somehow being included into something we should be rebelling against. Or we get DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are just marketing and branding attempts to suppress, again, what should be organized labor struggles, et cetera, and so on. So the overlaps between what Burton is doing in talking about the role of prisons in this society and shaping and managing the society, and what's happening outside, supposedly, to those of us, as he says, as he quotes Daruba bin Wahad in the epilogue, who are in the prison of the United States. In other words, the overlap is super important, that we at least begin to understand and appreciate. So again, salute to us in this class for even the intent, the endeavor, the effort, and let's continue to build from this great work and study all of its contents, references, and sources. So, all right, back with one more in the epilogue. So stay tuned. Hopefully you will continue to enjoy, and I'll see you in a minute. Peace.